People come for the triplex, but they stay for the high density commercial corridors.
Right. The big picture is that we're simply not building enough housing, or actually even more important than the eliminating single family zoning. It's really important to allow development as of right without any special permission. Getting to that idea of what all city planners have to do is change the zoning, and massive change happens, everything redevelops. In 2020, there were 34 duplexes and 9 triplexes. Building permits issued. Some of those are new. That includes conversions in a city with 120,000 parcels of land. So a pretty low number. My name is Paul Mogush. I work for the City of Minneapolis. I'm the manager of community planning. Here today to talk about Minneapolis 2040, which is the comprehensive plan that has been known for ending single-family zoning in the City of Minneapolis. I served as the project manager for this effort. I've been talking a lot about it in the last couple of years. In 2018, our City Council approved a comprehensive plan that set us on a path to eliminate single-family zoning. I think maybe it's not the most important thing we did in our efforts to improve the housing situation. But first, some quick context. Minneapolis has a population of about 425,000 people, and that's in the context of a larger region of about 3.5 million. We have a strong regional government, the Metropolitan Council, that oversees a whole lot of things, including land use planning. 7 counties, it encompasses 190 different cities. For the first time in decades, our city population is growing again. The benefits of that growth are not being shared by everyone. We have a strong overall economy. It's a great place to live if you're white. Minnesota and Minneapolis have some of the worst racial disparities in the nation, like income, wealth, homeownership, education, health outcomes, and others. That problem was really at the forefront of city planners in Minneapolis. When we began our regular 10-year update to the city's comprehensive plan back in 2016, we had to do this update. We started doing this work. We went out into the community and we asked people about their hopes and their dreams and their concerns for the future. And there was a really clear consensus early on from those conversations that this planning process really needed to address climate change, needed to address housing affordability, and it needed to address racial equity. To be honest with you, at the time, we as planners for the city didn't know what does it mean for a land use plan to work to eliminate racial disparities. But the folks at Mapping Prejudice were doing, this came out of the University of Minnesota. They were combing through every property deed in the city to document and map racially restrictive covenants, legal restrictions placed on the deeds of residential properties that prohibited current and future owners from renting or selling their properties to non-white households. And you can see some of the language excerpted from the racially restrictive covenant portion of that deed. These covenants, they were common in the first half of the 20th century in Minneapolis and in cities around the country. And they had a substantial impact on where people of color could and could not live. In 2016, there was renewed attention on the practice of redlining. The University of Richmond launched an online portal around that time that displayed high-resolution scans of redlining maps from cities around the country. Maps were created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, and they were used to guide loan officers in making decisions about mortgages. And under this guidance, lenders would only provide mortgages in the whitest parts of town, essentially, the green and blue areas shown in this map. For our planning process, we used these 2 projects on covenants and on redlining as a starting point for educating ourselves as planners, our elected officials, and the larger public about our nation's and our city's history of racist housing policy. So this is that same redlining map. So I'll take out the red and the yellow areas to illustrate a point. Lenders would only provide mortgages in the whitest parts of town, to the green and blue. Overlaid here in gray is where we had single family zoning up until last year. It's almost a 1-for-1 match. So the message was, white people, we have your back. You can get a mortgage for your single family home, and we won't allow apartment buildings, and the non-white renters. The real estate developers at the beginning of the 20th century followed suit with racially restrictive covenants. See that the red areas are individual dots showing racially restrictive covenants that the Mapping Prejudice project found. People of color were clearly left out of these neighborhoods, and the wealth building opportunity is clearly a substantial factor that contributed to the racial disparities that we see today. Look at what is the current racial makeup, and the areas that had restrictive covenants are still primarily white. Redlining is not legal in the overt geographic manner of those redlining maps, but it's not exactly a distant memory. And other predatory lending practices continue to this day. Racially restrictive covenants aren't enforceable anymore, but it hasn't been that long in the arc of our history. And as I showed before, those areas are still primarily white. And of course, most cities still have, the third layer being zoning, most cities still have large swaths of their city zoned only for single family homes. To start generating a discussion, we used the 1930s redlining map to show where they live. A pretty remarkable thing happened. We started seeing and hearing comments like, eliminate all R1A and R1, which is single family zoning, and include all buildings 1 to 4 units by right. Residents were asking for more density along transit routes and legalizing missing middle housing, and they were pointing out specific areas of the city that they viewed as having exclusionary zoning. This was pretty remarkable to us veteran planners who were more accustomed to not in my backyard sentiments coming out of public processes. Why is housing getting so expensive in the first place? And if you ask a developer that question, you'll get a lot of responses that are probably true, like construction costs, facing permit fees that are too high, expensive to build parking, there's lots of things that go into the high cost of housing. But the big picture is that we're simply not building enough housing overall. In Minneapolis and many other metro regions across the country, housing production simply isn't keeping up with population growth. The law of supply and demand takes over, rent goes up. And when the rent goes up, it goes up for everybody, but that disproportionately affects people of color. From 2000 to 2014, housing gets less affordable for everyone, but Hispanic households can only afford a few neighborhoods near the center of the city. And for Black households, not a single Minneapolis neighborhood is affordable. To try to tackle this from the standpoint of a land use plan was threefold. First, the plan ends single family zoning. We viewed this partly symbolic, looking at those three layers of racist housing policies. Single family zoning was one of them. But also from a practical standpoint, we expect that we will see that move opening up housing choice across our city and making it at least a little bit easier to build different types of housing in places that were previously zoned just for single family. Specifically, allow up to 3 units to be built where previously only 1 unit was allowed. And that's about half the city. The second is where we reintroduce the concept of missing middle housing, not a whole lot in between. Single family homes, larger apartment buildings. And then finally, we make it easier to build dense, multi-story, multifamily housing near transit to really try to tackle that supply and demand problem. The outer neighborhoods, now you can build up to a triplex or convert an existing house to 2 or 3 units, or add an ADU in the back. Yes, you can build up to 3 units, but we didn't expand the building envelope that you're allowed to build in. So all the rules that applied about building height and bulk and setbacks and so on, that applied to single family homes before, also apply to 2 and 3 unit build. I'm pretty confident that there's going to be enough building envelope to really accommodate 2 and 3 unit buildings, but we're going to be watching it closely.
Why 3?
Our first proposal was 4. Back of the napkin, we think you could fit 4 units on a typical lot in Minneapolis, which is about 5,000 square feet. Then after releasing that, we did some more detailed work to look at the architectural fit, and we realized 4 is just tough. It's just tough to fit 4 units, especially given maintaining the bulk and height and setback regulations, which our policymakers made very clear to us was going to be required. It was actually us as staff who dialed that back to 3. We have a maximum floor area ratio of 0.5. We exempt below ground habitable area, and we exempt the half story at the top of a house from habitable floor area. You can actually get 4,375 square feet of habitable area on a 5,000 square foot lot. You divide that into 3 units, suddenly you have a pretty livable unit.
Could that be an ownership opportunity? Like, can you condo map that?
You can, and anecdotally, we've seen some interest in that. To be an owner occupant in one of the units and get some cash flow from the other 1 or 2 units.
Just allowing parcels to be fragmented into smaller pieces of ownership will bring it to be more attainable to more people.
That's the hope. That's the hope, and we'll be tracking this, over the next 10 years before we do our next plan update, and we'll see how successful it is at that. We're optimistic, but we're going to be honest with ourselves and transparent about it. The second piece of this is in our inner neighborhoods closest to downtown. These are the places that were already a walkable mix of housing types that have been made illegal over the past few decades, now have reintroduced the possibility of building that full range of missing middle housing. The city decided to kind of freeze that in amber and say, we're done. This is what we've got. And what we've done now is open that back up so those neighborhoods can continue to evolve.
Unthawing process towards growth again.
And finally, both in our downtown and along the major bus routes and light rail throughout the city, dense multifamily, multi-story development is allowed as of right. No special permissions needed. This is really where we hope we can tackle the supply and demand problem. So whereas the first two, ending single family and introducing missing middle, is primarily about housing choice, this one is really about tackling that supply problem. Another thing that went into place on January 1st of 2020 was our inclusionary zoning policy that requires a certain percentage of units in multifamily housing projects above 50 units to be affordable. There was a lot of concern, as you would expect, that would perhaps slow down the market. Early indication is that it didn't. In 2020, our planning commission entitled about 6,000 new units of housing, which is far higher than anything we had seen in the previous decade. Something that's really core to this approach is the concept of predictability. It's really important to allow development as of right, as I mentioned, without any special permission. And I think this factor is actually even more important than the eliminating single-family zonings. Have design standards, yes, have a robust development review process, but we really need to allow in our zoning what we say we need to allow in order to achieve the goals. We've accompanied the traditional future land use map. So if you look at the comprehensive plan for just about any city anywhere, there will be a land use map that says this is where the housing can go, this is where the commercial can go, this is where the industrial can go. We've accompanied that with a parcel-specific built form map. So for each of the 120,000 or so parcels of land in the city, each one of those is assigned one of, I think, 14 built form districts that lays out in very clear and plain language the building types that are allowed and the building height and bulk that's allowed. In this example, in the Transit 20 built form district, you can see that it has an allowable height range of 6 to 20 stories. You submit your application for a building that's within that range, you will be approved to build that building. It's just clear what's allowed. There is a bit of an expansion of where dense multi-story multifamily housing is allowed. The maximum heights in each of the zoning districts were pretty low, 6 or 7 story apartment building, like they'd have to get an exception to the maximum height in almost every case. There's a lot of steps in the process that are discretionary and gives a planning commission or a city council a lot of opportunities to say no. We've tested this predictability approach on a smaller scale in neighborhood plans around the city, in places where there are real redevelopment opportunities, like this example here along the Midtown Greenway, which is a bike and pedestrian trail and a trench through the city. It's worked. That predictability approach result in a lot of really high quality infill development. The land use planning piece of this, but that's just one piece. We're very clear when we talk about this that the regulations are not enough. We just leave it to the zoning, we will still be leaving people behind from a housing standpoint. We need to continue to invest proactively in affordable housing. A whole list of strategies that our city is undertaking, that the zoning rules are absolutely essential. You have to get that right, but it's just a first step.
Several silver bullets deployed all at once to address this.
This is clearly about more than housing. We need places for those jobs. If we're going to do something about climate change, we need complete neighborhoods where people can meet their daily needs, making it easier to say yes and harder to say no when a proposal comes in that helps you achieve those goals. What made this work? How did you actually get your city council to approve this? 2.5 years, we put a lot of resources behind it. We made it fun and engaging for folks. So having that racial equity goal up at number one and having a housing affordability and choice goal, city council approved these goals at the beginning of the process, essentially telling us as planners, here is your charge. Work with the community and bring us back a draft plan that works towards achieving these goals. Advocacy groups started being created, and existing ones started focusing on these housing and affordability and choice issues. Main political champion, the city council member who is now the president of the city council, Lisa Bender, she is a city planner by training, and she stepped up and led her colleagues to a yes vote on this. We ended up with a 12-1 vote in favor of this plan.
As far as KPIs of how this is tracking to goals around homeownership or racial equity or housing affordability, how are you tracking that?
We have formed a partnership with the Minneapolis branch of the Federal Reserve Bank. They have a community outreach and kind of research arm on a pro bono basis, do some really in-depth tracking of the outcomes of this over the next 10 years with a series of housing indicators with counterfactuals. Compare what actually happens to what would have happened if we hadn't initiated these policy changes. The Minneapolis 2040 plan went into effect on January 1st, 2020. So we have a year of data now. In 2020, there were 34 duplexes and 9 triplexes. Building permits, some of those are new. That includes conversions in a city with 120,000 parcels of land. So a pretty low number. Throughout the planning process, there was a lot of concern that this change would have just a massive effect and that there would just be bulldozers, clearing neighborhoods and triplexes being built everywhere. We tried to reassure everybody at that time that we really expect the outcome of this to be pretty incremental. In year one, that has proved to be true. We don't make a projection. We just let the market do its thing, and we'll report on what happens.
Paul, thank you so much for the presentation.
My pleasure, Charlie. It was great talking with you today.